This is the Essay 2 Writing Workshop for English 203 World Literature, Fall 2018. In this writing workshop, I'll be going over tips for how to make sure that you successfully address the prompt for Essay 2, which was posted on Canvas on Tuesday, October 16th. Quick reminder before we get into the essay itself that the essay is due Thursday, November 8 at noon. And even though that seems like that's pretty far away, I do want to urge all of you to start thinking about and also working on the essay sooner rather than later. It's a difficult essay topic that asks you to put two texts into conversation with one another. So it will very much benefit you if you spend a little bit extra time thinking about what you want to write about, what texts you want to write about, what you want to say about them. And it'll also benefit you if you have more time to come up with the textual evidence from both of the texts that will help to support the argument that you devise. So start working now. Step 1 to writing a successful Essay 2 is to read the assignment at least twice. If you haven't read the assignment yet, I would urge you to press pause, print out Essay 2, the assignment sheet, and read through it before hitting play again. And the reason that I suggest that you read the assignment at least twice is that I want you to underline the assignment, figure out what's important, and make sure that you have all of your questions answered before you start writing the assignment. And hopefully the writing workshop will help to address lots of your questions. But if you do have any lingering questions, please take advantage of the Essay 2 Composition Forum and ask any questions that you may have there. Also, I urge all of you, whether or not you think you have questions, to take a look at the Essay 2 Composition Forum, because sometimes one of your classmates will ask a question that you didn't think you had, but that actually you weren't sure about once you see it. So do take a look at the Essay 2 Composition Forum. So the overview of the essay reads thus. This essay will require you to put two texts into conversation with one another. One of the texts is Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place, and the second text will be of your choosing from the below list, and we'll go over that list in just a moment. In considering the two texts, you will make an evidence-based argument about how the texts approach sociocultural differences and the interpersonal difficulties such differences may create. You must put equal emphasis on both texts, although Kincaid will be your jumping-off point. I want to define one phrase that I've used in this overview of the essay, and that's interpersonal difficulties. So what I mean by interpersonal difficulties are difficulties in relationships that people have with other human beings. So interpersonal relationships. And these relationships may be as close and important as the relationship between a mother and a daughter. They also may be relationships between strangers, such as a tourist and a native Antiguan. But the important thing to know is that what you're looking for and what you want to think about are the ways that sociocultural differences complicate and create difficulties in the relationships that people have with each other, both close relationships and relationships with strangers that they only meet once, and everything in between. Here's the essay topic. In A Small Place, Jamaica Kincaid depicts several instances in which sociocultural differences lead to misunderstandings, misjudgments, miscommunication, and other interpersonal complications. Between the tourist and the Antiguan native, for example, between black Antiguans and white Europeans during the colonial era, and between Kincaid, a British-educated narrator, and younger generation Antiguans. Furthermore, Kincaid suggests some of the complex historical, cultural, and social reasons that such interpersonal difficulties may have arisen, while also depicting some of the emotional and social consequences of such interpersonal difficulties. Likewise, in other texts we've read in English 203, sociocultural differences such as race, class, caste, culture, and age also complicate interactions and relationships. At the same time, these complications also lead to various difficulties and consequences. The key question you need to answer in your essay is this. In a small place in your second text, how and why do sociocultural differences complicate interpersonal relationships? And before going on to how to answer this question, I want to underscore how important this question is. This is the most important question, the most important sentence on the first page of the assignment. This is what tells you exactly what you need to write your essay about. So I'm going to repeat it. In a small place in your second text, how and why do sociocultural differences complicate interpersonal relationships? In answering this question, which is the most important question on page 1, the most important sentence on page 1 of the assignment sheet, in answering this question, be sure to 1. Consider and analyze both texts equally. So don't spend too much time on Kincaid and overlook your second text. Don't spend most of your time thinking about the second text and only write a sentence or two about Kincaid. Really try to have a balance between the two. The second thing that you need to do in answering this very important question is that you need to analyze both why and how. So why do sociocultural differences complicate relationships, and how do those differences, those sociocultural differences, produce complications and consequences? So if you think back to 2 slides ago, I gave you examples from Kincaid's text of the sociocultural differences that she depicts. So the differences between the tourist and the Antiguan native, between Black Antiguans and white Europeans during the colonial era, and between Kincaid herself and younger generation Antiguans. In my lectures on Kincaid, I also spend quite a bit of time thinking about the complex historical, cultural, and social reasons that the interpersonal difficulties Kincaid depicts may have arisen. So thinking about slavery, thinking about the impact of the colonial system on both colonists and also Black Antiguans, and so on and so forth. In my lectures, I also spent some time thinking about the emotional and social consequences of such interpersonal difficulties. So in looking at all of these things, I effectively covered, in terms of Kincaid, a lot of why Kincaid thinks sociocultural differences can complicate relationships, and also how those sociocultural differences produce complications and consequences. So if you want to rewatch the lectures, as I very strongly recommend that you do before you finish your papers, you will see me doing some of the work to help you answer the questions that you need to answer in order to address the essay prompt. There are 4 possible second texts that you can put into conversation with Kincaid, and I will say it again, you need to remember to address your second text in as much detail as you address Kincaid. Make sure to devote roughly 50% of your essay to each of the texts. The 4 texts that you can look at in conversation with Kincaid are Anoa, Grandmother's Letters, The Subordinate, and Noli Me Tangere. A word of advice: successful essays will choose a second text that speaks to Kincaid's A Small Place in a meaningful way. And what I mean by this is you shouldn't just choose your favorite text from the list of 4. You shouldn't just choose the text that you took the most notes on when you were studying for the quizzes. You shouldn't just choose the text that you spent the most time reading, or that you were the most alert for the lecture on. You really should choose a second text that you think will allow you to successfully answer the essay prompt, that will allow you to come up with really interesting ways of thinking about that text and also Kincaid in conversation with one another. And in order to choose a good second text, you may decide that you want to go with a second text that addresses interpersonal complications that are similar to those that appear in A Small Place. So similar kinds of problems and breakdowns in the relationships that appear in the two texts. You might want to choose a second text that addresses a similar sociocultural difference to A Small Place. So cultural differences or differences in age and their consequences. You might also want to choose a text that really reminds you of A Small Place in some ways, but is in some ways compellingly different from it. So you might want to choose a text that is totally different from Kincaid in some way, but there's also a compelling connection between them in another way. But the important point that I want you to keep in mind is that you need to choose a second text that will allow you to articulate a meaningful thesis about how and why sociocultural differences can complicate interpersonal relationships. So, how are you going to go about thinking of a topic, choosing sociocultural differences to think about in Kincaid, and how are you going to choose a second text? The first thing that you should do, you should start with Kincaid because you know that you're going to have to talk about Kincaid. So you want to get some notes and ideas down on Kincaid, and then you can narrow down your focus from there. So step 2A, brainstorm the topic as it relates to Kincaid. In the essay assignment itself, I gave you some examples of sociocultural differences that Kincaid discusses in A Small Place. One, the tourist and the Antiguan native. So those are sociocultural differences. They have to do with race, they have to do with culture, they have to do with nationality, they have to do with class also. The second set of sociocultural differences that I listed in the first page of the assignment sheet are the sociocultural differences between Black Antiguans and white Europeans during the colonial era. Again, this has to do with race, it has to do with class, it has to do with colonial power, it has to do with heritage. So there are a lot of sociocultural differences wrapped up in number 2, and you could choose to focus on some or all of them or just one of them. The third set of sociocultural differences that I mentioned in the assignment are the sociocultural differences between Kincaid's British educated narrator, that is Kincaid herself, and younger generation Antiguans. And this is primarily in section 3 that you find this when she talks about how alienated she feels from younger generation Antiguans, and at those moments when she's describing her reaction to the teenage pageant and other elements of modern, independent, self-governing Antigua. And I want to add a number 4 to the list. You may find other differences in A Small Place that lead to interpersonal difficulties. So you may find something that connects number 1 and 2, or number 1 and 3, or something like that. And it's perfectly fine to deviate from this list. You don't just have to choose from numbers 1, 2, and 3. Maybe you're really interested in how people of different ages perceive things differently. So maybe you want to think about how Kincaid relates to the teenage pageant participants that I just mentioned in section 3 of A Small Place, and maybe you want to put that into conversation with what Kincaid has to say about her mother in section 2 of A Small Place. And that would allow you to think about age and generations and generational cultures in a way that doesn't just adhere to number 1, 2, and 3 on the list that I've provided here. So I'm trying to give you some ideas to go to when you're brainstorming, but don't feel confined by the framework that I've offered. I really want you to choose ideas and concepts and sociocultural differences that really interest you. So from that list of 4, which depending on how many ideas you have that fall under number 4, may be more like a list of 6 or 7, I want you to choose at least 2 sociocultural differences to explore in further detail. And the reason I'm telling you to explore further 2 rather than just 1 is that you may find that your second choice, or what you thought was your second choice, ends up being more interesting to you when you actually look at where in Kincaid she talks about those sociocultural differences that you're interested in. So choose 2 from the list, and then go back through Kincaid's text. Flip through the sections in which she's talking about relevant topics, and make note in a notebook. Actually write this all out by hand. Make note of what sociocultural contexts seem to be at play. So if you're thinking about the tourist and the native, make note of when race seems to be important. Make note of when the history of colonialism may seem to be important. Make note of when class seems to be important, and so on and so forth. So really try to figure out exactly what's at stake, because that rough list of what the sociocultural contexts are for these differences, that will help you to narrow in on a topic, narrow in on exactly what you want to talk about. The second thing that you should make sure to make note of, again, by hand in a notebook on a piece of paper, are passages in which a sociocultural difference leads to an interpersonal complication. So look for those passages that stick out in your mind. Maybe some of them are ones that I talked about in the lecture, ones that you think really represent an interesting or compelling, powerful, painful, whatever it is, something that you think is worth noting, some moment when there's an interpersonal complication, when Kincaid seems to be in pain, when she seems to be angry, when other people seem to be upset in one way or another. So make note of those passages. After you're done, make rough notes about how each of the sociocultural differences that you have made note of produce complications and why they produce complications. So start thinking about the how and the why, how you would answer those questions. Because one thing that you may find is that you're really interested in one idea, but you can't really answer the question of the how or the why, and that you can answer that question better with another idea. So do make rough notes about the how and the why before you choose which topic within Kincaid's text you might want to look at. The next step, step 2b, is to brainstorm the topic as it relates to other course texts. And I would recommend that you do this before you really decide for sure what in Kincaid you want to focus on. So leave yourself at least a little bit open, even though I hope you will have an inclination to think about one topic in Kincaid rather than the other. A reminder, the 4 texts that you can look at are Anoa, Grandmother's Letters, The Subordinate, and Noli Me Tangere. And you should choose at least 2 of the 4 texts to make notes on. So again, I don't want you to limit yourself too much. I would like for you to think about 2 texts that you might write on, not just one. And even if you're sure that you have a text that will work, I would really encourage you to do this for a second text. Because as I said, with regard to Kincaid, you may think you know what you want to write about, but oftentimes you end up figuring out that your second choice of an idea or your second choice of a text is the one that's going to be the most productive. So if you leave yourself open at this early stage in the writing process, it will serve many of you very, very well. So for 2 of the 4 texts, flip through the text, revisit your notes, and make note of the following: what sociocultural contexts seem to be at play, passages in which a sociocultural difference leads to an interpersonal complication, and then after you do this, make rough notes about the how and the why. And as with Kincaid, you may find that you can answer the how and the why more easily or more powerfully or in a much more interesting way with one text than another. So once you're done with this step, you'll have two possible secondary texts to talk about in relation to Kincaid, and you'll have two possible topics within Kincaid to discuss. At that point, you need to narrow down your options and come up with a pairing that you think is going to be compelling. How do you do this? Here's what I would suggest. I would suggest that you take those notes that you made on Kincaid and you take the notes that you made on the two other texts that you might write about and ask yourself the following questions. First question, are there overlaps in terms of the types of sociocultural differences discussed by the texts? So, do two texts talk about class? Do two of your texts talk about race? Do two of your texts talk about age or generational cultures, so older and younger generations, and so on and so forth. So think about whether there are any overlaps in the specific types of sociocultural differences that the texts discuss. And they don't have to be exact. So we talked a lot about the caste system and how it influenced Indian culture when thinking about Grandmother's Letters and The Subordinate. And even though the caste system is its own thing, it does relate to class. And so when Kincaid talks about class and the relative affluence of tourists, the fact that they have more money, even though she's not talking about a caste system, you could still put it into conversation, compelling conversation with a text like Grandmother's Letters or a text like The Subordinate that does think about the caste system in India. So they don't have to be exact matches, exact one-to-one matches. They can just be similar. So think about those overlaps. The second thing that you should ask yourself is whether or not there are overlaps in terms of the historical, cultural, and social reasons that the differences create difficulties. So we've read multiple texts that think about British colonialism, and although my lecture on Grandmother's Letters and The Subordinate tried to draw distinctions between the kind of colonialism that happened in India and the kind of colonialism that happened in Antigua, they are both situations in which you have a country that was a British colony for hundreds of years, right? So that would be an example of a historical overlap. You have British colonialism at play. And you may find other very compelling ways in which two of your texts overlap in terms of the historical, cultural, and social reasons that the differences create difficulties. So keep your thinking broad here. And again, it doesn't have to be, one-to-one. You don't have to think literally and say, well, is British colonialism at play in both of the texts? If not, it doesn't apply. You can think about other kinds of similar contexts that you can compare in a meaningful way. The third question I want you to ask yourself is about the types of interpersonal difficulties each text depicts. So are there similar difficulties that are depicted in two of the texts? So are there breakdowns in terms of the communication between family members, so parents and children, that are depicted in multiple texts? Are there breakdowns in communication and misunderstandings and misjudgments that occur between total strangers in two of the texts? So think about how the interpersonal difficulties in two texts relate to one another. And part of the reason that I gave you the example of Kincaid at the beginning of the essay topic section of the assignment sheet was to show you that Kincaid really depicts a range of difficulties and breakdowns in interpersonal communication. So there's a lot to work with in her text. So try to match up a second text to the kinds of interpersonal difficulties that she depicts. That is one one way of finding a connection between two texts, and it's not the only way. So you could talk about strangers in Kincaid and family members in another text, but do make sure that in one way or another you find a compelling connection between the texts that you choose to talk about. The fourth question that may lead you to come up with an interesting and compelling and successful text pairing is this: are there similar emotional and social consequences of interpersonal difficulties that are depicted in two of the texts? So in Kincaid, you have everything from shame to guilt to anger to feeling like she is alienated from a younger generation of Antiguans. So you have a lot of emotional consequences. You also have depicted in Kincaid's text a lot of social consequences. So think about the ways that tourists and natives in Antigua can't understand one another, and the total breakdown in communication that she depicts at various points in section 1 of A Small Place. So there are a lot of consequences that she thinks about. So think about the emotional and social consequences that are at play in some of the other texts that we've read, and specifically the two texts that you've chosen to think about in greater detail. And as I said when talking about number 3, you don't have to have the text line up in all 4 of the ways that I have, suggested here. So in terms of the types of sociocultural differences discussed, in terms of the historical, cultural, and social reasons that the differences create difficulties, in terms of the difficulties themselves and what they look like, and also in terms of the consequences, they don't need to line up one-to-one. And in many cases, the most compelling pairings will be the ones in which compellingly the two texts line up in a couple of the categories, but they're very different in others. But you do want to make sure that there is some connection between them. So do look for texts that line up in at least one of these categories, maybe 2 of these categories. And then you'll want to think about those similarities and differences in exploring the relationships between the two texts. The third step that you should complete once you've already chosen your focus within Kincaid's text and once you've chosen a second text to put into conversation with Kincaid is to devise a working thesis statement. And I want to underscore working in this slide. So this is not a final thesis statement. This is not a polished thesis statement. This is the argument that you are going to go with that will guide you in collecting your evidence. This is the thesis statement that will serve you now, but you're going to revise it at a later stage. So your thesis statement should be 1 to 2 sentences, and I'll give you examples in a little bit about what your thesis statement can look like. But it should not be longer than 2 sentences, but some of you may need 2 sentences, especially if you're thinking about both the similarities and the differences between Kincaid and your second text. The thesis statement needs to appear in your introductory paragraph, and in most cases it should be the very last sentences in your introduction. Your thesis statement needs to do several things. For one, it needs to communicate your argument. In this case, your argument about how and why sociocultural differences produce interpersonal complications in the texts at hand. The second thing your thesis statement needs to do is that it has to put Kincaid into conversation with your second text. So the thesis statement can't just be about one text or the other, it has to be about both of them and how they relate to one another. Your thesis statement must be specific, not vague, in relation to your texts and their relationship with each other, but also in relation to the topic. So make sure that you're being really clear and really specific, and I'll show you some examples in a moment of thesis statements that are too vague and therefore don't work. So I'll show you what you need to avoid. And also I'll tell you about what specific thesis statements will look like. The next thing your thesis statement needs to do is it needs to not be just a factual statement or a summary of Kincaid or your second text. And the way to make sure that you're doing this, i.e. avoiding just making a factual statement or giving a summary, is to ensure that your claims are debatable. That is, ensure that someone could potentially argue against your thesis statement, which is what makes it an argument. So I really want you to offer your own take on the text and what you think the text is doing. Don't just offer a plot summary. So really try to make claims about the text at hand and how they relate to one another. Here's a tip, and this relates to my emphasis on the working thesis statement. As you write your paper, you may find yourself arguing something slightly different from what you thought you were going to argue when you first wrote your thesis statement. This happens all the time, and it's not a bad thing, it's actually a good thing. So make sure to look at your thesis statement after you've finished a full draft of your paper and revise your thesis statement if necessary. And one of the last things that you should do before turning in your paper, and I really urge you to do this not just in this class, but in all of your classes that require essays. Take a final look at your thesis after you've finished editing your paper. And the reason that you might want to do this is that you might want to change it at that stage, at the very end, because you may even find that you argue something slightly different than what you thought you did through that last round of edits that you make. So the thesis statement is an incredibly important sentence or two, and it's really important that you really clearly articulate your argument in that one or two sentences. So the last thing that you should do before submitting your essay is to make sure that your thesis statement really matches the content of your essay, that it really stakes the claims that you're going to prove in the essay to follow. So these are 3 weak thesis statements, and I'm going to explain why they're weak. So the first one reads as follows. In A Small Place, Kincaid writes about the impact of British colonialism. Grandmother's Letters also deals with British colonialism. This is a statement of fact. In both of these texts, British colonialism is depicted. This thesis statement isn't telling me anything about what the impact of British colonialism is in either of the texts, let alone trying to articulate how the impact of British colonialism in A Small Place relates to the impact of British colonialism in Grandmother's Letters. So make sure that you're very specific about the how and the why in terms of the interpersonal difficulties that you'll have to talk about in this paper. And make sure that you're not just telling me what the topic is. So don't just tell me what those 2 texts you're going to discuss are. Make sure to stake claims, make claims about what the texts are doing, what they're saying, what they're demonstrating in relation to the topic. The second weak thesis statement, because it's too vague, is as follows. Jamaica Kincaid writes about the painful feelings that may arise in a person due to race-based breakdowns in communication. Noli me tangere is similar in some ways and different in others. So this is an interesting example of a thesis statement that is specific and makes a claim with regard to the first text, but then doesn't really say anything about the second text. And I will say that every time I teach a class, I get a paper in which a student says, you know, this text is similar in some ways to this other text, and it's different in other ways. That doesn't tell me anything. The second text could be similar in that it was written in another language, in that it depicts similar scenes, it depicts similar emotions, or that it depicts different emotions, depicts different characters, depicts different kinds of sociocultural differences. So really make sure that you're specific and setting out what the similarities and differences are if that's what you are going to base your thesis statement on. And a reminder, you do have to indicate the relationship between the 2 texts. So you will have to put them into conversation with one another. So make sure that you're not going to, that you don't just say that they're similar in some ways and different in others. Be specific, be explicit. The third weak thesis statement, Kincaid reveals that the legacy of slavery is important, and the subordinate reveals that the Indian caste system is important. The reason that I included this is that students will often say that something is important in their thesis statement, thinking that they're making a claim, but important can mean so many different things. It can be, a thing can be important in countless ways. It can be important because of its emotional impact on someone. It can be historically important. It can be important for the impact that it has on society. And those are just three of literally countless examples of how something could be important in this context. So don't just say something is important, really be explicit, say why it's important, just like you need to say how two texts are similar to one another and how they're different. I'm going to give you two models for strong thesis statements, and the first part of this slide gives you a fill-in-the-blank version, and then the second part of it tells you what you need to do to fill in those blanks. So strong thesis statement model 1, and this is a model that you might use if you have texts that are similar in a lot of ways, and you're going to focus on the similarities between the two texts. So both Kincaid and blank, insert name of second text here, reveal, argue, demonstrate, or a synonym for that, that blank. So both Kincaid and Amma demonstrate that, and then you want to insert your statement about sociocultural differences and how and why they create interpersonal complications in the two texts. So again, this could be your model if you were looking at mostly the similarities between two texts. If you're also going to make differences a key part of your argument, you may want to use this model as your thesis statement model. In a small place, Jamaica Kincaid reveals, argues, demonstrates, or some other synonym that blank. This is similar to blank, although blank. So in a small place, Jamaica Kincaid demonstrates that, make your argument about Kincaid. Then say why, that it's similar to the other text, and say why it's similar, how it's similar. And then finish that part of the sentence, or finish that second sentence by discussing why the text is different. And a quick note, even if you choose thesis statement model 1 and focus on the similarities between the two texts, much more than you focus on the differences, you may want to still talk about the differences in analyzing the text, especially if they're pretty obvious differences. So say you want to talk about the relationship between strangers in Kincaid and the relationship between family members in another text and put those two into conversation. You don't need to make that difference key to your thesis statement, but you do want to acknowledge it at some point. But just because you acknowledge it doesn't mean that you have to go with the second model that I've given you here for a strong thesis statement. What really should drive your choice of which model to go with, if you go with one of these models, which you don't need to do, what should drive your choice is the extent to which those differences that you see between the texts will be key to your argument, will be key to the claims that you make about how and why sociocultural differences create interpersonal complications in the two texts. The fourth step to writing Essay 2 successfully is to collect your evidence. And you should do this after you have a draft thesis statement, because now you know what you need to look for. And you may already have rough notes, especially if you've done what I suggested you do in steps 2A and 2B, but you really do need to go back and look at the text again, and you might need to also rewatch the lecture videos. Many of the passages that Dr. Allen and I have discussed in our lectures are ones that you could use in your papers. And this is especially true of the passages that I discussed in my lectures on A Small Place, because I did have this essay topic in mind as I was writing the lecture. So make sure to rewatch the lecture videos. You may have your attention drawn to passages that you might not have thought were relevant, but in rethinking them, you realize are relevant to your paper topic. And you also may save yourself some time in identifying the passages that will be most relevant, because in the lecture videos, you'll have page numbers. You'll also have both Dr. Allen and I, and also the people who attended class in person, sometimes analyzing some of the passages that you may use. And you don't need to agree with anyone else's analysis of the passages, but it may at least spur your thinking or give you ideas for how to approach the passages at hand. The next thing that you should do, and I do recommend that you rewatch the lecture videos first, but the next thing that you should do is to skim Kincaid's text again and skim your second text again. And part of the reason that you should do this is to make sure that you have the plot of your text down, that you have names and details down, so that when you actually start writing your paper, you have all of those concrete facts straight in your mind. But the other thing that you need to do, the other reason that skimming Kincaid's text again will help you, is that you can flag some other passages that you think may be relevant. So I guarantee you that there's a very good chance that you will find passages that you didn't flag immediately, that you didn't remember, and that didn't appear in the lecture videos, but are very, very relevant to your paper. And you want to make sure that you choose the best evidence, not the easiest evidence to remember. So do skim Kincaid's text, and do skim your second text after you've watched the lectures associated with those texts. And I'm going to say it again, and I think this is the last time I'm going to say it, so I'll say it twice. You need to pay equally close attention to both texts. Again, you need to pay equally close attention to both texts. It won't work to spend 3/4 of your paper on Kincaid and 1/4 of your paper on ANOA. And likewise, if you spend 3/4 of your paper on ANOA and only 1/4 on Kincaid, that will be problematic too. You really want to spend equal time on both texts. Once you have your evidence, the next thing you need to do is to analyze it. How do you analyze evidence effectively? The first thing you need to remember is that when you quote from a text, do not let the text speak for itself. Analyze the quote. I can't tell you how many papers I've gotten from students that will just plop a quote into a paragraph and don't actually say anything after they plop that quote in. Sometimes students will end a paragraph with a quote. Sometimes they'll just include a quote and then move on to their next point. Don't let the text speak for itself. You really need to say something about that quote after you include it. And what do you need to say? Close reading Kincaid or your second text will require you to thoughtfully analyze and interpret the ideas and the language that the text engages with. So you need to focus on the details in the quote, both the conceptual details, so the ideas that that quote is bringing up, and also the language, especially if there's powerful language that is included in the quote. You need to make clear how your analysis of a quotation from the text directly backs up your claims about the text. In other words, you must make it clear how your analysis supports your thesis statement. So don't just drop in a quote. Think about why the ideas and the language in that quote are important and how they prove your claims about the text at hand. So for every quote, you want to explain how it demonstrates why sociocultural differences complicate relationships, or how the differences that you're discussing produce complications and consequences. So really do think about how every single quote supports your thesis statement, how it relates back to your argument, and never ever let a quote speak for itself. So I wanted to give you an actual example of what analysis might look like. There are lots of places where Kincaid talks about her rage, about her anger, and this would be one way of analyzing one of those passages in which she discusses her rage. So imagine that you have put a quote in about Kincaid's rage. And maybe this paragraph is one that's about the emotional impact of colonialism on Kincaid as a person, as an author, as an Antiguan. And maybe your claim is about how painful and how difficult and how powerless the colonial context makes Kincaid feel. So you insert a quote about rage here, and then this might be your analysis. Kincaid's description of her rage in this passage conveys the extent to which colonial contexts have impacted her. Rage is a powerful emotion, and here Kincaid seems to be overtaken by the anger she feels. She is emotionally powerless here, just as she believes her ancestors were powerless during the era of slavery on Antigua. So one of the things that you'll note here is that I haven't just said one thing about this passage, this quote that I have plopped into my paper. I've said multiple things. So I've thought about the word rage and why the word rage is important and why the idea of rage is important, how it relates to the claim that I'm making in the paragraph about the emotional impact of colonial contexts, and it also ties back to possible thesis statements or overall arguments that I'm making about the ways that colonial contexts create interpersonal differences between potentially black and white people on Antigua, or tourists and natives, or any number of other things. So what I want you to take from this is that you shouldn't just say one thing. Don't let a quote speak for itself. Say multiple things and really try to dig beneath the surface and think about why the quote that you're including is important. And if you don't have that much to say about a quote, then that might be an indication that you haven't chosen a quote that is serving you well, and that you might want to look for another quote instead that you'll have more to think about with. On to the nuts and bolts of quoting and citing. This is how you successfully cite quotes according to MLA standards, and this is taken from Purdue OWL, which is an excellent resource and can help you to format works cited pages, can help you to figure out what different kinds of entries from different kinds of text should look like in text citations and all sorts of other formatting issues. So if you're ever in doubt, just Google Purdue OWL and you'll find some helpful resources. So there are three different ways that you can quote and cite prose, and this is for quotes fewer than 4 lines long. The first mentions the name of the author before the quote, and that's why the author name is not included in the parenthetical citation. So Wordsworth stated that romantic poetry was marked by a, quote, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. 263 indicates the page number on which that quote appeared. The second example does not mention the name of the author in the sentence, and that's why the name of the author has to appear in the citation. Romantic poetry is characterized by the, quote, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Wordsworth, 263. Again, the 263 is the page number. So if you've said Kincaid's name in the sentence that includes the quote, you do not need to include her name in the parenthetical citation. All you need to include is the page number. If, however, you have not included her name in the sentence, you do want to include her name in the parenthetical citation. Step 6, structure your essay. The first thing that you need to do in structuring your essay is to come up with a title. and you need to come up with a title that relates to the specific content of your paper. And don't forget, coming up with an original and interesting title is one of the things that you will be graded on. So do come up with a working title as you start writing your essay, and you might want to change your title once you get further into the writing process, but do make sure that you have at least a working title as you write your essay, because you do want to remember to have a title in the end, as it is something that you are graded on. And do make sure that the title relates to the content of your paper. So don't just say Kincaid essay or essay 2 or something like that. Really try to come up with a title that conveys the ideas that you will discuss in the paper, the argument that you're going to make. The first paragraph is going to be an introduction, and it needs to offer information about your two texts. So who is the author? What is the title of the text? You might want to provide a very brief overview of each of the texts, highlighting the things that will be relevant to your argument. You also need to include in your introduction a summary of the terms and ideas from the text that you will discuss. So say in Kincaid you talk about the tourist figure. You're going to want to give the reader an idea of who the tourist is in Kincaid's text. Say you want to talk about the caste system in the subordinate, you're going to want to introduce the caste system in the introduction. Don't wait until a body paragraph. So introduce the texts and also the key terms and key ideas that you're going to discuss in that introductory paragraph. The introductory paragraph also needs to include a clear thesis statement that indicates how and why sociocultural differences lead to interpersonal difficulties in your texts. And we've already talked about how to devise a strong thesis statement, and I've already told you that you may need to revise your thesis statement as you write your essay. And just want to re-emphasize that you do want to have a working thesis statement early in the writing process, because that will help you to collect your evidence and analyze your evidence, but really do go back and edit that thesis statement once you have a full draft of your essay, and then also potentially once again before you actually submit your essay. The very first sentence of your essay should not be so broad, vague, or universal that it could start off any essay. Really try to come up with something interesting and specific to what follows. Every semester, I and countless other professors across the country will get essays that make a really general, broad statement, like, since the beginning of time, violence has been a key aspect of humanity, or something like that. Since the beginning of time in all human societies, something that broad, that general. Really try to avoid those kinds of statements. Try to start with something that really relates to what you're going to discuss. And you may want to write your first sentence a little bit later in the writing process in order to avoid starting with a broad statement. So instead of starting with a broad, vague, or universal statement that could really start almost any essay or a lot of different essays, you want to start with something to catch the reader's attention. So you may want to start with a provocative question or a provocative idea, something from the text or from your ideas about the text that you think is going to hook the person who reads the essay. So try to really start with something specific. Try to start with something that would catch your attention if you picked up the essay. What is the essay about? What are the stakes of the essay? What is something that is going to get you and your reader to want to read everything that follows? Paragraphs 2, 3, 4, etc. I don't know how many body paragraphs each of you is going to have, but you do have to write 1,500 words, so you definitely will have multiple body paragraphs. And each of your body paragraphs needs to begin with a clear topic sentence. And that topic sentence needs to sum up the topic of the paragraph. So it has to be very specific to the paragraph. So if it's a paragraph about Kincaid, make sure that Kincaid is in the topic sentence. If it's a paragraph paragraph about both of your texts, make sure that that is clear in the topic sentence, and also make sure it's clear what you're going to talk about in relation to those texts. One way to think about the topic sentence is that it will offer one main claim or argument that supports your thesis statement, and that's going to be what your body paragraph tries to do. So you can think of that topic sentence as the place where you're making the claim, you're making the argument that relates to your overall argument, and then in everything that follows, you're going to provide the textual evidence that backs up that claim. And of course, you're also going to provide a close reading of each piece of textual evidence that demonstrates how the textual evidence supports the claim. So never forget that you do need to complete the close reading, the analysis that shows the relevance of the textual evidence. Here is a sample topic sentence for a paragraph that I have already suggested to you might work in an essay like this one. And the context in which I brought up this paragraph was when talking about how to analyze textual evidence, how to analyze the quotes that you use from your primary sources in order to make the best use of them, and in order to connect them back to your overall argument and therefore your thesis statement and what you're trying to prove in your essay. So here's a topic sentence for that paragraph that I imagined earlier about the emotional impact of colonialism on Kincaid. So here's what I've written. In sections 2 and 3 of A Small Place, Kincaid depicts the complex emotional impact of relationships informed by colonialism. So this sentence does a few things. First, it tells us that this paragraph is going to be about a small place, and specifically about sections 2 and 3 of A Small Place. That's where the textual evidence is going to come from. That is the scope of the argument, textually at least. This topic sentence also tells me that this paragraph is going to be about the emotional impact of these interpersonal difficulties, right? So this is a paragraph about the consequences of the breakdowns that this paper is going to talk about. And so it will have evidence about how colonially informed relationships have impacted Kincaid. And so it's very clear in delimiting or defining the topic, the conceptual topic that the paragraph will be on. So we know about the text, the part of the text, which you don't necessarily have to do, but definitely you want to indicate what text the paragraph is going to talk about, and then also the topic. So here, the emotional impact of colonially influenced relationships. And this also is the kind of topic sentence that very clearly relates back to an argument that would address the requirements of the arguments for this essay. So it clearly is about interpersonal difficulties, so relationships between people, and it helps to answer the questions of the how and why that the essay asks you to address. So topic sentences should really do all of those things. It should tell you the text that the topic sentence, that paragraph is going to be about, and it should tell you about the topic, and it needs to relate back to the thesis statement and the overall argument. In organizing your body paragraphs, you may want to use one of two models. The first model is that of organizing your paragraphs around key ideas. So in this case, you might want to organize body paragraphs around key ideas related to how and why sociocultural differences complicate relationships, and how each of those key ideas is evidenced in your two texts. So this would be a really good model if you want to talk about two texts at once. And I encourage you, all of you, to think about whether or not you can do this, because if you can do it, it can be a very, very successful way of organizing your essay and making sure that you really put the two texts into conversation with one another. So an example of how you would write a paragraph structured around a key idea is at the bottom of the slide. So you might want to write a paragraph about the emotional pain Kincaid and the grandmother and grandmother's letters experience as a result of relationships dictated by British colonialism. So this is a variation on the paragraph we just imagined, but that other paragraph was just about the emotional consequences of British colonial relationships on Kincaid. Instead, you could write a paragraph on Kincaid and grandmother's letters put together. And if you do that sort of integrated analysis, it can be a lot easier in some cases to figure out the relationship between the two texts at hand and connect them in meaningful ways. So again, I really encourage you to think about whether or not you can structure your essay around key ideas, around a series of key ideas that help you to address the essay prompt. The second way that you can organize your paragraphs are by text. So you could have 2 paragraphs about Kincaid, followed by 2 paragraphs about your second text, or 1 paragraph about Kincaid, then a paragraph about your second text, then another paragraph about Kincaid, and another paragraph about your second text. And in this case, with this organization, what you're going to want to do in each body paragraph is to make a claim about how and or why sociocultural differences complicate relationships in the one text at hand. So if you choose this structure, you may have a paragraph about the how in Kincaid, followed by a paragraph about the how in your second text, followed by a paragraph about the why in Kincaid, followed by the why in your second text, or maybe a paragraph about the how in Kincaid, followed by a paragraph about the why in Kincaid, and then 2 paragraphs about the how and the why in your second text. There are lots of different ways that you can organize by text, organize paragraphs by text. Just make sure that every paragraph is making a specific claim about the text at hand, and you should be in good shape. I do want to note that if you choose this structure, so organizing paragraphs according to text, you do still want to include some references to the other texts in your paragraphs about one primary text. So, for example, in your Kincaid paragraphs, you should make references to points of similarity or difference from your second text, and these don't need to be huge references, but just references in passing. If it's something that you're going to talk about in relation to the other text in the following paragraph, just say that in passing. Or if there's a distinct point of difference, you might want to mention that even if it's just in passing. So if you have a paragraph about Kincaid followed by a paragraph about, say, the subordinate, you may make just a couple of quick references to the subordinate in your paragraph about Kincaid. And then you may want to make more significant references to Kincaid in your paragraph about the subordinate, because you've already talked about Kincaid, you've proven some points about Kincaid, and so you can refer back to them when you talk about the subordinate. So in paragraphs about your second text, you can refer back to the previous paragraph or paragraphs about Kincaid in order to continue putting the two texts into conversation. And this is really what I want to emphasize, is no matter what structure you choose, you really do want to put the two texts into conversation with one another. And if you really put two texts into conversation with one another, you're going to be able to say a lot more about each text than you could if you just talked about one text or the other text. So make sure that you're using your discussion about Kincaid to propel forward your argument about the second text and your discussion of the second text, and make sure that you use that second text to propel your argument forward about Kincaid. And you should make sure to do this even if you have your paragraphs about Kincaid separate from your paragraphs about your second text. So occasional references to the other text within those paragraphs will help to make sure that you really do put those two texts into conversation with one another. Here's a warning. This is very, very important. Many of you the vast majority of you probably, if not all of you, have learned how to write a compare and contrast essay. This essay is not a compare and contrast essay, and you will not do as well as you could do on this essay if that's the format that you adhere to. So make sure not to adhere to the structure of a compare and contrast essay. You really do need to aim for an integrated discussion of the text, even if you organize your paragraphs by text. So not one paragraph on Kincaid, one paragraph on the second text, and a paragraph comparing and contrasting the two. That will not work. You can have separate paragraphs on Kincaid in your other text, but through those references, those cross-references that you make in each of those paragraphs, you will put the two texts into conversation. That conversation shouldn't happen in its own paragraph. It should happen within every single paragraph. The last paragraph of your essay will be your conclusion. And you don't need to have a really long conclusion in this essay, make sure that it doesn't go on for pages and pages. You should maybe aim for about a half a page, certainly not much more than that. And in your conclusion, you need to link the various parts of your argument into one cohesive whole, and you need to reassert and restate your argument in new words. So don't just repeat your thesis statement, but do try to convey the argument that you have just proven in the essay in new words. And some of the words can overlap with your thesis statement, but do try to rephrase it in a new way. Then I want you to finish your conclusion by introducing a new but related idea. So the last thing that you need to do in the conclusion is open that conclusion up. So leave the reader something to think about. So for example, you might want to think about how your argument relates to other texts in the course. So maybe you have a paper that puts Anoa into conversation with Kincaid's A Small Place. But you also might want to end by mentioning how similar ideas come up in Grandmother's Letters and The Subordinate. For example. Another thing that you could do to introduce a new but related idea at the end of your paper is to talk about how your argument relates to your own experiences. So this is a rare place in a formal essay for an English class or for a college class at all, in which your own experience could be a compelling place to turn. Maybe you yourself have had something happen to you or have had experiences that remind you in one way or another of the experiences that Kincaid and your other author describe. So maybe you want to spend 3 sentences or 2 sentences discussing how your own experiences relate. You may instead want to talk about how your argument relates to other things you've witnessed or heard about. So something that you have seen in the news recently, a global issue or an issue related to what's happening in Mississippi today or the United States today, just something that's going on right now, another historical issue potentially. Or you could relate your argument to something that you've learned about in your other classes at USM. So maybe you're taking World Civ right now, and maybe some of the things that you learned about in World Civ somehow relate to this paper. That's where you can bring this knowledge in. So the point is to, in one way or another, end by thinking about the broader stakes, the broader importance of your argument. Why does it matter? Not just in terms of this class, not just in terms of the 2 texts that you have just talked about at great length, but in terms of other historical context, other current context, political context, social context, and so on and so forth. So this should be the payoff of the essay, that you have just proven some stuff about these 2 texts, and then you have the opportunity to think about why all of this matters in broader context or in other contexts. And again, a few sentences will suffice, but those few sentences really can be the payoff, what really drives your point home. This is why what you're talking about matters, not just in one context, but in other contexts. The last thing that you need to include in your essay is a works cited page. And you need to make sure that you cite both Kincaid's A Small Place and your second text. How do you put together a works cited page? Again, this information is taken from the Purdue OWL site. And if you want to see more examples of citations, you can just Google Purdue OWL MLA and you will be taken to a page that will give you lots more examples. But the quick rundown of the information that you need to include in citations and works cited pages, you need to list this information in this order. And I should note that not all types of sources will include all of this information, but this is the maximum amount of information that it could include. So the first thing you need to list is the author, and then the title of the source, the title of container, and that may be a little confusing, but what that means is if it's a poem in a book of poetry, or a short story in a book of short stories, or an essay in a collection of essays, that collection of essays, a collection of poetry, that book of short stories, that's the container that they're talking about, the longer work in which the shorter work appears. Other contributors, so if there's an editor, for example, or translator, version number, publisher, publication date, location. And location means where in the text does your text appear, and this is for shorter texts that are parts of longer texts. So here are a couple of examples, and these are both examples that will be relevant to the citations for this paper. So A Small Place is a standalone text, so the citation for A Small Place will follow this format. So you have the name, Saeed, Edward, so last name, first name, the title of the text, the publisher, and the year. So Kincaid's text will be Kincaid, Jamaica, A Small Place, and then the publisher and the year. The other texts that you have to choose from are all in a Global Crossroad, in the Global Crossroads textbook. So you will want to include the author name, and then the title of the text. Then you'll want to include Global Crossroads, the editor of Global Crossroads, the publisher, the publication date, so the year that Global Crossroads was published, and then the pages of the selection you have chosen. So what pages does Grandmother's Letters appear on, for example? What pages does ANOA appear on, for example? So these are the two types of citations that you need to know in order to cite your two texts for this paper. The last thing that you need to do in writing your essay is to make sure that you've met all of the additional requirements outlined in the assignment sheet. A reminder that the essay needs to include the academic honesty statement at the top of the very first page of your essay. Also, the essay must be a minimum of 1,500 words in length, and that 1,500 words, it does not include the heading, the title, the works cited page, and the academic honesty statement. So do make sure that you take that into account as you're writing. 1,500 words is longer than the first essay, so you will have to write more, but also you're going to be writing about a bigger topic, and also you're going to be writing about two texts. So all of you should be able to get to 1,500 words. Make sure that you do not include the academic honesty statement or those other items in your word count, or else you may be below the minimum and you will be penalized if that is the case. Also, make sure not to exceed 1,750 words. So for those of you who like to write a lot, this will be your challenge to not write too far above the benchmark that we are setting for you of 1,500 words. The paper format needs to adhere to the requirements outlined in the assignment sheet. So you need to have that interesting original title, and you may need to edit it at the last minute, just like you may want to make some last edits to your thesis statement to make sure that it matches the content of the essay and what you've just proven in the essay. You need to include that works cited page. Make sure that it is in that essay, that it is the last page. Every semester, some people forget to include the works cited page, so make sure that you include it so that you're not marked down for not including it. Make sure that your essay is typed, double-spaced, written in 12-point Times or Times New Roman font, and formatted according to standard MLA style. And again, if you have any questions about standard MLA style, Purdue OWL is the place to go. The file name, and this is very important, must conform to the following file name format: Essay2, last name, first name. So if your name is John Doe, and none of your names actually are John Doe, but let's just pretend, your file name would be Essay2 Doe John. So make sure that your essay, the document title, matches that formatting. And the last thing I want to say is good luck. I hope that this essay will be challenging in ways that will make you rethink the text, but also rethink some of the ideas that we've been discussing in class. But I hope that it won't be so challenging that you won't enjoy it at least a little bit. Writing is hard for all of us, including me, and part of my job is to be a writer and to write articles and books and so on and so forth. And I know from lots of first-hand experience that writing can be really difficult and sometimes painful. So I don't expect any of you to have just a great time writing this essay from start to finish, but I hope that it does make you think in new ways about ideas that are important to you or will be important to your lives. And if nothing else, I hope that all of you choose a topic that you find interesting in one way or another. And a last reminder, don't forget to make use of the discussion board, the Essay2 Composition Forum. If you have any questions or if you hit any walls or you're not sure about something, that is where you can post your questions, pose your questions, and have them answered. And as I said earlier, I do encourage all of you to look at that discussion board, even if you think you know exactly what you want to write, even if you think you have a really good handle on what the essay is supposed to do, what it's supposed to be about, because you may still find it helpful to see your classmates' questions and also the answers that we have to your classmates' questions. So good luck. I hope you find it to be a valuable experience, and please let us know if you have any questions.